I wanted to talk about a few different things. First of all, I love when a gospel reading like we have today, we finish with the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ, the good news of Jesus Christ, you hypocrites. Always kind of one of those, you head out to the car afterwards. I love when Jesus is so gracious and kind to us, right? This is a hard one. Christ saying, I'm not here to bring peace. But one of the things that I think is powerful about that, I mean, we can get into all the familial relationship aspects of it, but the idea that following Christ is something that potentially sets us at odds with those who are around us, and perhaps those who are closest to us. I know we raise our children in the faith, and how does that go as they begin to make their own way in this world? There are all kinds of different ways in which we do that, and I think part of our instinct is perhaps to make following Jesus less distinct, so that following that path does not put us quite at such a right angle, perhaps with those nearest to us. And that becomes difficult. There are a lot of ways in which following Christ is something that is countercultural. In spite of perhaps there being a lot of language about how Christian this nation is, you can certainly tell by the number of crosses that are worn in public, certainly these days, but by actions or culture, that may not be quite as obvious. But I think the challenge becomes when we start to make decisions that are different than those who are close to us, those we recognize regularly as a part of our groups, be it family, perhaps. It's maybe a difficult one for us, or maybe it's our work colleagues or neighbors or friend set or whatever the case might be. And these aren't necessarily huge decisions, although some of them may be. But one of the things that I am kind of captured by at times is the mountain of small decisions made over weeks and months and years and decades. Decisions, I would say perhaps most importantly, like what gets onto a family calendar and what does not get onto a family calendar, right? That's a hard one. Does everything go on the family calendar? I'm assuming for most of you, you have in a week 7 days and 24 hours like I do. I am a giant fan, you can talk to Marielle about this, but I am a giant fan of sleeping. So that takes a chunk of that time out of my schedule, but nonetheless, what makes the calendar and what does not? Okay. Another item. What are the things that get recorded in, this is a little dated. Side note, I loved when the Vakels were new here. She was like, do you really just write down money on a piece of paper and give it to somebody and that's like a thing? I'm like, well, now that you say it that way, it feels funny, but yes. But here's the second one, calendar. What makes it into the checkbook and what doesn't make it into the checkbook? Now, please hear me. I'm not suggesting that these things are things that I have all figured out and locked down, and you, sorry, what was hypocrites? Yeah, no, that's not what this is. We all struggle with this. I think one of the things as we look at this time and place, which derailed my thinking about the sermon a little bit is recognizing that school has started in this last week here in Palo Alto and in many places at this time. And as many of you perhaps are aware, there was the death, tragically, of an incoming senior at Gunn High School here in Palo Alto that was unexpected and in many ways a part of the narrative that has been a part of our community for decades now. And the question is, perhaps reviewing the theme from our retreat coming up this next weekend, what are we sowing, right? The idea of sowing in your garden, not sowing, but what are we sowing? What are we planting? Gardening, perhaps, although Pastor Friederike blew a number of holes in this analogy, but gardening also lends itself to this idea, unless you live in California and have irrigation. Set that aside. What happens if gardening is something that you only do once every 6 months? Right? What about learning a language? What about learning an instrument? What about all of these things? What are the things that are core to lifelong health? Now, there's a lot of things: physical exercise, diet. There's a number of things like this. When I was in ministry earlier in my time in Minnesota, there was a study that came out, and I forget the organization that did it. Oddly enough, I think it was Thrivent. But at any rate, they had done a health survey that was like huge nationally. Tens of thousands of people participated in it. And one of the things that they were looking at was resilience and health in children and youth. And one of the key factors in this, one of the top 10 items, was having healthy relationships with adults who are not family members. Now, you might think of a baseball coach or a third grade teacher. You might think of any number of scenarios where that might happen. But where does that happen in our society? Or let's drill this down a little further. Where does this happen in Palo Alto that is not limited by the 9 months of a school year or the 3 months of a baseball season? Here. Here. This is the kind of thing that we are particularly good at. And I would argue that we are in a society here locally in Silicon Valley where we are really, really good at a number of fields, often very technical, often not humanities-based. It seems curious to me that Emily, who starts heading out a week from today for here, out of all the people that we could have hired, happens to be a licensed social worker. Seems like a particularly good background to be in, to work with our youth. But when we talk about relationships and community, Jesus is talking about the strain, but there's an assumption in that already, that there are relationships and that there are communities. The fact of the matter is, that has been wrecked in the United States over the last 50 years. We do not have personal relationships, and community for us is large number of random people who happen to live in physically close proximity to one another. That is not how we are built to thrive. That is not how God intends us to live. And if you think, well, Pastor Matt, I think what we should do is I'm willing to commit to June 12th. I will come to the church for 24 hours. I'll sleep in the pew, and then I'll see you next June 12th. That's not going to work. And when we think of our young people, what kind of skills and tools do we expect them to have as adults such that they would thrive, that they would be resilient? It's when they are plugged into this kind of place. There are very few of them left in this society, and the wheels are coming off the bus, folks. The wheels are coming off the bus. There was a time about a decade ago, 15 years ago maybe, it was early in my ministry here, Lutheran College was here, their choir was here and sang in concert. They're really good, and it was cool. And there was this moment where we were working on parking outside, because if you remember back in that day, our parking lot had 3 aisles, and so you had a 50-50 chance of pulling in the wrong way. It was perfectly laid out. And on top of that, the lines were no longer visible. So it was kind of a crapshoot when you came in as to how this was going to happen. And so the idea was, this is going to be a packed house. We needed to go out there and help people with the parking. And so Jerry Butler, some of you recall Jerry, he was like our parking captain. And he was out there, and if you can picture that, Jerry would be fabulous at that sort of thing. And he was out there, and there were a couple of other folks who were going to assist. And a high schooler raced in, a little late for that project, came up to me and said, "Sorry I'm late, Pastor Matt, but how can I help with the parking? Where should I go?" And I stopped and I looked at him and I said, "You should go talk to Jerry Butler outside. Do you know who Jerry Butler is?" Now think about that question. I'm assuming that a teenager maybe wouldn't know an adult who's not his parent or his school teacher or his coach, right? I wouldn't necessarily know that. He looked at me, blinked, and said, "Yeah, I know Jerry," and headed out the door. I can't convey to you how big that is for this young man's future success in life, that he was in a community regularly such that these relationships could be formed. Now, will there be tensions in that? Yes. Are there things in this life that dedicating June 12th once a year is going to be sufficient and awesome? Absolutely. But being a healthy, resilient adult who is created for relationship and community, being in relationship and community, that's not going to be a June 12th kind of thing. That's going to be a January 1 through December 31 kind of thing. So what does that mean? That means every time that calendar app gets opened, there are decisions to make, right? And what kind of regular decisions 20 years later lead you to this different place? Now, when we look at the good news here, we might look at Jesus' language about super psyched for mixing it up with you all when I get there. We can take bad news out of this. And I think it's one of those things where we don't like the stress of these relationship challenges. But there is good news in this. There is an assumption of relationships. An assumption of relationships that build community. And in that community, we are centered in our baptisms, in the water that marks us as children of God and as people of Christ in this place. Amen.